Welcome back. So in this video, what I want to do is get into communism and fascism, and in particular, the Soviet Union and fascist Italy in the interwar era. Communism and fascism will be our two big new ideologies in the interwar era, and so let's begin first with really the center of communism in the world, and that is the Soviet Union. And so my song of the day is the Hymn of the Bolshevik Party, written in 1938. And so now with communism and the Soviet Union, we go back to the ideas of Marx and Engels. And so notice the lyrics there. The sparking genius of Marx and Engels envisioned the future rise of communism. Lenin has outlined the road to freedom, and great Stalin is leading us through it. And so there are those propaganda posters showing Marx, Engels, Lenin, and now Stalin. And so again, Marx back in the 1840s and Engels put together the Marxist socialist vision of the future, and now it was up to Lenin to figure out how do I actually implement this. And well, Stalin and Lenin before him will be trying to figure out how to actually create this dictatorship of the proletariat and create a communist society. And ultimately, it's not going to work out. So back in 1917, we had our Russian Revolution, and with the October Revolution in 1917, the Bolsheviks under Lenin seized power in St. Petersburg. Lenin had promised people peace, land, and bread, and well, he just redistributes land to peasants, but again, he tries to fulfill that Marxist revolutionary agenda of seizing the means of production and putting them in the hands of the workers, and so really the government. And now the Bolshevik government is fighting for its existence. After making peace with the German Empire, Russia now devolves into the Russian Civil War. And so from 1918 to 1922, as I mentioned in the previous video, you'll have the Red Army of the Bolsheviks fighting the White Army of basically everybody else. Tsarists, monarchists, liberals, even socialists who didn't like the Bolsheviks will join together in a widely diverse army to try to contain the Red Army of the Bolsheviks, but it's not going to be successful. The White Army will gain support from the Western Allies, from the US and others. The White Army will also be supported by other non-ethnic Russian groups, such as the Georgians and Kazakhs, the Finns and the Poles, but ultimately the Red Army and the Bolsheviks under Leon Trotsky will prevail. And so by 1922, we officially have the Soviet Union. It goes by officially the title, the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics, abbreviated as the USSR. So in the Cyrillic alphabet, the abbreviation CCCP. So when you see these propaganda posters, that's what that stands for. It stands for the USSR. And notice it's not Russia, but the Union of Soviet Socialist Republics. Now again, they're not true republics. They're governed by party bureaucrats who are governed by Moscow. So yes, you'll technically have the Kazakh Soviet Socialist Republic and the Georgian Soviet Socialist Republic and the Ukrainian Soviet Socialist Republic, but ultimately they're all governed from Moscow, with the Russian Soviet Socialist Republic being the largest. And well, by 1922, not only do we have the USSR, but now Lenin is on his way to death. In 1922, Lenin suffered a stroke, and well, 2 years later, after declining health, he's going to die. And well, there's still today in Red Square in Moscow, Lenin's tomb to celebrate the great Marxist revolutionary communist leader. His body has been embalmed and is still there today. But as he was dying in his last years, there was now a scramble for power among the leaders of the Communist Party, our former Bolsheviks. There was a scramble for power among the leaders of the Communist Party for who would succeed Lenin as the leader of the party and ultimately the dictator of the Soviet Union. The man who's going to emerge from the power struggle by 1927 is Joseph Stalin, who's going to be the dictator of Russia for a very long time. Again, all the way through 1953, well after World War II. So we'll deal with him later with the Cold War. You'll deal with him later more in American history. But Joseph Stalin was actually not Russian. He was from the territory, the people of here, Georgia, in the Caucasus. Stalin's actually a made-up name, meaning man of steel. Again, he just adopted that as his new last name, which was originally Zugashvili. Stalin was from Georgia, but eventually becomes the dictator of really Russia. Again, as I mentioned before, Napoleon, born in Corsica, rules over France. Hitler, as we'll get to in the next video, born in Austria, but will become the leader of Germany. So again, there's this weird thing in history with these dictators who were born not exactly in the places where they will rule. But Stalin has been rising through the ranks of the Bolshevik Party for years. He originally was from a poor Georgian family. He spent some time in a seminary being educated, but decided to become a Marxist revolutionary. And so he worked his way up through the Bolshevik ranks, doing all sorts of odd jobs. And so Lenin knows him very well, and well, Stalin now becomes a major figure with the Russian Revolution. So there is Lenin, Trotsky, and Stalin, the three major Bolshevik leaders. And so by 1927, Stalin has gained power, especially because his formal title is General Secretary. He gains power ultimately because, as the General Secretary, he basically controlled the party bureaucracy and really the government bureaucracy. And so his title throughout his reign, if you will be General Secretary. But as the guy who appointed people into positions of power, well, if he appoints you as, let's say, the local bureaucrat to run some town, you're going to be very thankful for him for choosing you. And so a lot of people will be loyal to Stalin because he put them in positions of power. And so he's going to now be able to tap into his support among the party and government bureaucracy to edge out his rivals for power, such as Leon Trotsky. We'll get back to him later. But what does Stalin do beginning now in 1927? He launches now a massive industrial buildup. Remember, Russia has never been really the leading industrial power. It really picked up the pace right before World War I, but it's still a largely agricultural country. And so what Stalin wants to do is really now emphasize industrial production. Remember now, with the quote-unquote dictatorship of the proletariat, the communist government Stalin controls also controls big business. There are no private industrial capitalists like Tom Benson. And so what Stalin does now is create what are called these 5-year plans. The idea of the 5-year plan is to produce, X amount of coal mines, Y amount of steel mills, and really rev up the Soviet Union's industrial production. It has varying levels of success, but again, everything now is geared toward the production of industry, state-owned industry in the Soviet Union. So Gloria Stalin, the propaganda poster says there, the great architect of communism. During the Russian Civil War, Lenin had basically allowed farmers to maintain private ownership of land and to make a profit, which again goes against the basics of communism, but Lenin decided to let it slide. And well, during the war, the Russian Red Army basically forced farmers to give them food and supplies. And now the question becomes, what do we do with agriculture in the Soviet Union? And Stalin now initiates a new program called the collectivization of farms. So remember, ever since the beginning of civilization, agriculture has been at the heart of civilization. As we've gone on through history, the dream of the vast majority of people who live in agriculture has been to own their own land. Again, if you're a farmer, you want to own your own land, provide food for your family, sell what extra you have. And again, you don't want to have to owe rent to a landlord. You don't want to be a serf farming for a landlord. And so Russia now has a lot of peasants who own their own land and doing pretty well. But now Stalin comes in and says, we're going to collectivize farms. And so the collectivization of farms produces ultimately state-run farms. And so now instead of you operating your own acres, now the Soviet government comes in and says, yeah, we're taking all these acres in this neighborhood, making them one collectivized farm. So collectivized farms, a state-owned and state-run farm. So now the government gives you the factories. It tells you now what to plant. And so ultimately, farmers now work for the government, farming on what we can basically consider large plantations. And Stalin's going to get a lot of pushback from the peasants on this, and he'll actually have to back off a bit because it's creating so much resistance. But he finds somebody to scapegoat and turn into an enemy. And so part of Stalin's campaign of collectivizing farms also includes eliminating a group called the kulaks. The kulaks were wealthier peasants Stalin had exterminated. They're wealthier peasants Stalin had exterminated. How do we now collectivize farms? Well, let's try to rally the peasants against the wealthier peasants. You have, again, a very small minority of peasants that are doing pretty well. Notice on the right you have a basic Russian peasant hut, and here at the bottom would be a house of a kulak. Again, looks much better. And kulaks are pretty efficient, made extra money, they were pretty well off. So kulaks, these well-to-do peasants. And well, no, they definitely want to oppose the collectivization of farms, and so Stalin orders that they're done away with. And so the propaganda poster there, let us destroy the kulaks as a class. They're hoarding grain. They are preventing ultimately the progress of agriculture. So we gotta get rid of them. Away with private peasants. The private peasants are most bestial, brutal, savage exploiters who in the history of other countries have time and again restored the power of landlords, czars, priests, and capitalists. And so, we gotta get rid of the quote-unquote class enemy. Part of the collectivization of farms is going to lead to another major event in Stalinist Russia, and that is forced famine in the Ukraine, in the country today called Ukraine. And so Stalin will, as part of his collectivization of farms, force famine in the Ukraine. He will deny food, he will have soldiers go in and take food in a bid to promote collectivization of farms and also to break Ukrainian nationalism. Again, Ukrainians are not the same as Russians, and so ultimately to crush Ukrainian nationalism and force the collectivization of farms, he will engage in forced famine in the Ukraine. And so now the Soviet Union is going to have these massive state-run, state-operated farms producing goods, but ultimately they're going to not be that successful. And in the end, what you're going to have as a result of Stalin's early reign is the massacre and the death of millions of people through the collectivization of farms and the forced famine in Ukraine. And so Ukrainian history in Ukraine today, they call this the Holodomor of 1932-1933, the forced hunger. No one knows exactly for sure how many Ukrainians were killed as a result of forcing these areas to have a famine, but it's estimated 3 to 7 millions. And well, Stalin's death count doesn't end there. In 1937 and 38, right before World War II, Stalin will initiate what are called the Great Purges. The Great Purges were the mass execution and or arrest of supposed enemies of Stalin. What Stalin did was he feared for his position in the party, he feared for his position as the head of the government, and so he basically sent his secret police after supposed enemies, whether they were actual enemies or not. And so Leon Trotsky had been a major rival of Stalin. Trotsky and Stalin disagreed as leaders of the Communist Party in the time of Lenin's later life. They disagreed over agriculture and industry. What do we do with these things? What do we do with this proletarian revolution? Trotsky said, let's keep the revolution up and keep pushing for communist revolutions throughout the world. Stalin was like, no, let's focus on Russia. And so eventually Trotsky's supporters will be eliminated from the bureaucracy. They'll eventually be eliminated, period. And then Trotsky himself will be tracked down to Mexico City, where he was living in 1940, and an assassin supported by Stalin will drive an ice axe into Trotsky's head. And so the Trotskyites are defeated. Back to some photos I showed you in the previous video with various members of Stalin's government being eliminated from photos because, well, they were being eliminated for real. Notice the 3 out of 5 Russian commanders there were executed by Stalin's purges. And so Stalin's going to eliminate or have arrested, it's estimated millions, maybe 2 million people ultimately because of this perceived threat. Again, there's still a lot of questions today about exactly how many people were killed, why exactly Stalin did this, but Stalin was someone who was very much paranoid about his position by this point. And well, let's say you were killed and your family would be guilty by association. They might not be killed, but they may be sent to a gulag. And so gulags were forced labor camps in Russia. They were forced labor camps in Russia, famously out in Siberia, though you had a lot of them also in Western Russia. So if you were someone who opposed collectivization of farms, if you're someone who opposed Stalin, or you were related to somebody who opposed Stalin's agenda in some way, you could be sent to these forced labor camps as a quote-unquote sort of enemy of the state. And so Stalin's reign over Russia, very brutal with many millions of lives spent, and this is even before World War II, which as we'll see later will cost and take up even more Soviet lives. And so let's turn to the communism versus fascism chart, which I put on Canvas. And so what I want to stress first, and we'll get back to fascism later, is notice politically, communists and fascists are very similar. What they both agree on is that the state comes before the individual. The communist and fascist governments will be totalitarian. So back to their chart was totalitarianism. And they'll have one-party rule under a dictator. And so whether it's, Hitler in Germany for a fascist government or Soviet Union led by Stalin, we have one-party rule under a dictator. So communists and fascists are both anti-liberal and anti-democratic. You don't have individual rights. The government may say you have rights, but not really. You're not going to have a fair trial. If you're arrested as part of Stalin's Great Purges, you're not getting a fair trial. You're basically being sentenced to death or sentenced to something. You're being found guilty regardless. Again, you don't have individual rights. We don't have multiple parties. We don't have true elections. Oh, what a surprise. The government wins 99% of the votes. Surprise. And so with that, again, both communist and fascist, anti-liberal and anti-democratic, where the state comes before the individual. Let's turn to the society aspect of communism. And again, this shouldn't be surprising. As I've stressed before, when it comes to society, go back to Marx. Marx lays out the vision of the history of class struggles. And history is the history of class struggles. Proletariat versus bourgeoisie. And so in the world, again, this whole nationalism stuff for a committed communist doesn't matter. Again, you may be a Russian worker or a German worker, but again, we're all part of the proletariat, and so we have an international movement here, and communism's very internationalist. Again, the last words of the Communist Manifesto, workers of the world unite. Again, it doesn't matter what government you live under, the working men have no country. The state is just a tool of bourgeois oppression, and so let us communists, let us try to unite the world through this sort of internationalism. And so notice the propaganda poster here. The USSR is the shock brigade of the world's proletariat. So we, the Soviet Union, were the leaders of the proletarian revolution around the world. And as I've already mentioned, but I want to stress it again, on the economic front, communists are against free market capitalism. So again, this goes back to the 1840s. This goes back to the earliest rise of socialism as a result of the Industrial Revolution. Well, communists don't want free market capitalism. And so what they're going to result in, or what this results in, is a command economy. And so when I say the government owns industry and runs industry, runs collectivized farms, what I'm talking about here is a command economy. The government owns businesses and transportation. In the Soviet mindset, the Soviet government is the government of the proletariat. And so the proletariat, through Stalin and the Communist Party, will run business and transportation and farms for the good of everyone. And so, again, there is no Tom Benson in a Soviet society. There are no industrial entrepreneurs, private individuals who own private businesses. No. What happens is that you have what's called central planning. So in an office building like this, Gosplan, the state planning committee, bureaucrats in here would basically determine, okay, this steel mill in this town is going to produce X amount of steel, which means we're going to need to take Y amount of iron ore from this town that needs to be mined from this mine or something and send it over there. We're going to have to take, this amount of coal from over here and send it to this factory. And so the government is not responding to really true supply and demand. No, what's happening is the government's determining supply and demand ultimately. The government manages resources. And well, if you go to a grocery store, you have the state grocery store. And the state determines how much bread is, how much pickles are, because it's being produced by the pickle factory and the bread factory. And so all aspects of the economy are being controlled by the government, not through private individual initiative or decision making. You have apparatchiks, you have bureaucrats, ultimately the members of the party apparatus making decisions about production. And well, if you meet your quota and exceed your quota, if you do even more than the government wants you to do, you can become a Stakhanovite. And a Stakhanovite was somebody who basically went above and beyond what the government wanted him to produce and got rewarded for it. And so if you were someone who went above and beyond, you can get rewarded with better products, maybe more pay, because again, we still have money in the system. But what happens ultimately is this is not going to be a true classless society. Party bureaucrats, apparatchiks, certain individuals will be preferred by the party and the government and will have access to better grocery stores and better cars and things like that. And so again, it's not going to truly be a true communist system. But with communism on the economic front, you have a command economy. And as we'll get back to at the end of the Cold War later, the command economies of communist countries will ultimately fail. So let's jump now to the other side of the political spectrum. And so, as I said a minute ago, fascism and communism, what do they have in common? They both believe that the state is greater than the individual. So in fascist governments, you won't have liberal values being protected. You're not going to have true democracy. And let's go back to why they're called fascist. And so notice this old symbol coming from the ancient Roman Republic called the fasces. And so even though the Fasces for peoples today still is a symbol referring to the old Roman Republic, so again, in the U.S. Republic, we still have the Fasces here and there. The French Republic has the Fasces as its symbol. What you're going to have now is fascists embrace the idea of the Fasces, because as I said a long time ago, the Fasces, this axe with a bundle of sticks, represents the power and authority of the state. And so as the old officials of the Roman Republic would enter a town, the judges, they'd be preceded by these carriers of the Fasces, symbolizing the unity, the strength, those sticks united together, and the strength and unity of the Roman Republic, and also the authority of its officials. And so back to sort of authority and unity, major ideas of fascism. Now, fascism, unlike all other ideologies, fascism's the one that is very much open to interpretation. Depending on where you are in Europe, fascism can mean different things. And so there isn't one sort of fascist theorist, like with communism you have Marx, with liberalism you have John Locke. And so people take fascism in different directions. And it's easier to explain what fascists are opposed to than explain what fascists are for. But what are fascists for or against? And well, let's turn to the societal front. And so with fascists are very nationalist. So this is why I kind of compare it to communism, where communism puts class over nation. Fascists try to put nation over class. So very extremely nationalist and believing in social Darwinism. Look, every class has a role to play. So no, we don't want to eliminate classes. We don't want this classless society like those commies want. Notice the propaganda poster from the fascists, the Nazis in Germany later. I like this one here because it kind of emphasizes the putting of nation before class. And you have there, it says at the bottom in German, "We remain comrades." And it says here in the middle, "then as today." And if you notice, you have here an engineer, again, someone very much a member of the middle class, holding hands with a laborer, someone from the working class. And so we're comrades today, just like we were, notice their shadows, just like we were back in the front lines of the First World War, fighting for the German Vaterland, fighting for the German nation. And so let's put class differences aside and emphasize our national beliefs. And well, let's be very militaristic. And not that communists weren't militaristic, but it's a major aspect of fascists. Again, let's wear uniforms and have salutes and rallies because, think back to social Darwinism, we want to show how strong our nation is. And so let's march around, let's promote war and look really warlike to show how strong our nation is. And together we'll fight communism. So notice the French fascist poster here, communism, enemy of France, and there's the French fascists strangling the communist wolf. And so fascists will gain a lot of support from lower middle class and eventually the upper middle class business owners who are afraid of communism, which is going to be most attractive in the interwar era to the industrial working class. And so communism and fascism, very different views on the issue of class and nation, which make them very much opposites in Europe. When it comes to fascist perspectives on the economy, it's a little complicated. So fascists are like communists in that they're generally going to be against free market capitalism, again, that intense competition among entrepreneurs. Fascists are going to be okay, though, with capitalism. Fascists do not want a command economy. No, fascists are very much opposed to communism, communist ideals, and the ideas of a command economy. And so, though the economy should be more regulated, so they're still pro-capitalism, but the state needs to have a bigger hand in how the economy is run, especially because war is going to happen with World War II, especially state involvement in military industries. Again, fascists, because unions typically supported socialists and communists, again, the fascists will oppose unions. And so the fascist angle on the economy is kind of fluid. It depends on who you're talking to in Europe, but generally they're capitalists, but just not free market. A good example here is the Volkswagen. And so Ferdinand Porsche, major German automaker, will produce what originally was called the KDF-Wagen. KDF in German is an abbreviation for Kraft durch Freude, meaning strength through joy. And so part of Hitler's fascist government will be the idea of, well, how do we keep workers happy? Well, let's give them benefits. And well, if you save up enough money, you can through the Strength Through Joy program, because we want to make sure our workers are happy and are strong by being happy. you can earn ultimately and pay for a KDF-Wagen, the original Volkswagen. And so Hitler wants a Volkswagen, literally in German meaning a people's car, and he'll turn to Ferdinand Porsche to produce this. But ultimately, when World War II comes around, no longer is Ferdinand Porsche getting a contract by the government to produce KDF-Wagens, he's getting a contract to produce tanks. And so the Volkswagen Beetle, ultimately is what it's going to become, is put on hold and produced after the war. But with that, Ferdinand Porsche and other German industrialists, business owners, farmers, etc., they'll be able to still privately own their industries and their farms, whatever it may be. And throughout Europe, you have all these various fascist groups. Again, they're not all the same. They all have different relationships to Christian churches. They're either anti-Semitic or they're not. And so there's no real one true fascist program, but those are all the things they have in common. And so in Austria, the Fatherland Front, in Romania, the Iron Guard. And so very diverse group of different fascist groups. But the originator is going to come from Italy. And so let's end now with the rise of fascism in Italy briefly. So thinking back to our general trends and developments in the interwar era, I mentioned all these types of instability, and well, all these types of instability are in Italy right after the war. You're going to have political instability, the economic instability as Italy's economy is shaken. You're going to have the social and cultural instability, all these warriors coming back from the front who are now used to violence, and well, the international stability. A lot of Italians are really, really angry that Italy didn't get everything was promised in the First World War after the Paris Peace Conference. Again, Italy and the Italians say, look, we lost 650,000 soldiers killed. Look at how many we got wounded. And we didn't get everything the Allies promised we'd get. Again, the Italian front throughout the war really didn't change. And in 1918, as you can tell by the red lines there, the German Austro-Hungarian offensive pushed the Italians back almost to Venice. And so now the Italians want things like Fiume here that they were promised, and they're not going to get it. And so you have a lot of discontent in Italy. So you have strikes, you have a liberal democracy that isn't able to respond effectively to the crises that are happening. The Italian government seems weak. And well, into this picture steps Benito Mussolini. Mussolini is somebody who actually began his life as a socialist. He was from a sort of middle-class family. He was a teacher for a little while, but eventually he becomes a socialist and is the editor of a socialist newspaper. And well, when war breaks out, while the Socialist Party opposes the war, Mussolini decides he likes the war and wants to go and defend Italia. And so he joins the Italian army and fights in the First World War. And after the war, eventually begins to produce his own political movement. He breaks away from socialism and now begins to assemble an ideology, these basics here of fascism. And well, he's very fluid. He's like a political chameleon who kind of adapts to the situation around him. But by 1919, he's going to form the first fascist party. So again, right during the year of the Paris Peace Conference, right after World War I, we have our first fascist party, which in Italian was technically called Partito Nazionale Fascista. And so Mussolini now has his fascist party, which starts to gain support. He rails against the Paris Peace Conference for not giving Italy everything it was owed. He rails against all these workers who are holding up Italian production. He, rallies people against the liberal democracy for failing to deal with all the post-war economic problems Italy has. And so, to help drive this home, he forms what are called ultimately the Black Shirts, because, well, surprise, they wear black shirts. But the Black Shirts were basically the fascist gang that Mussolini controlled. Again, as I said in the previous video, you have all these political parties and movements, ideologies, with their own armed paramilitary groups, we'd call them today. And so these black shirts were basically fascist gangs, or gang members, who would go around and beat up socialists, beat up communists. They would break strikes and attack unions. Technically called the Voluntary Militia for National Security, the Black Shirts and the Fascist Party started gaining more and more authority. More and more local fascists were being elected to local government. And so the movement grew and grew as Mussolini tapped into the anger of Italians toward the various instabilities of the era. And this all comes to a head in 1922 with an event called the March on Rome. So in the past several years, Mussolini's gaining support, his fascist party's gaining power in various parts, especially of northern Italy, and now they have a grand demonstration. And what happens is that fascists in the black shirts march on Rome. There's a giant march, begins in Naples, but it marches to Rome. Mussolini himself doesn't walk the whole way, he just gets his photo taken, but basically the fascists march on Rome, and the government ministers in Rome turn to the king, Victor Emmanuel III, descendant, grandson of Victor Emmanuel II, the first king of United Italy. And the government ministers say, hey, king, we got all these fascists marching to Rome here, tens of thousands of fascists that are a threat to our government. Do you agree to let the military go out and try to stop this protest march? And the king's kind of worried about starting a civil war in Italy. And so Victor Emmanuel III says, no, I'm not sending out the army to shut this march down. And so the government ministers all resign in protest, and Victor Emmanuel III contacts Mussolini and says, hey, Mussolini, do you want to be the new prime minister? And with that, Mussolini now becomes the leader of Italy. Mussolini has had a march on Rome. He actually was coming down from Milan. He didn't actually march with the march itself. But now he becomes a prime minister, and in about a few years, by 1926, Mussolini slowly builds a totalitarian state. He takes over as prime minister. He eventually gets the fascist party to become the major party in the legislature. He basically dissolves other political parties and tries to build a totalitarian state. Of the three totalitarian states, Nazi Germany, Soviet Union, and Fascist Italy is really the least totalitarian, but again, he's sort of following this agenda. He'll have a youth group, the Balilas, named after a little boy in the 1700s who threw a rock at an Austrian official and launched a revolution in Genoa. He'll have a secret police, the Organization for Vigilance and Repression of Anti-Fascism. Notice here, he has this big old head over the party headquarters with CCCS. So again, vote for fascists. And by 1925, he takes the title of Il Duce. Il Duce, he'll go by this title for the next 30 years. Again, back to what totalitarian states have. They have a one-party, one-leader dictatorship. And so Il Duce in Italian means the leader. And so now Mussolini, even though the king is still king, Mussolini slowly acquires more and more power in this constitutional monarchy, which he basically turns into a totalitarian state. And so notice the propaganda posters here salute the leader, marching along through Rome there, appealing to the crowds, and using a new type of salute. So again, back to fascists using various types of salute. And well, this one is originally called the Roman salute. Again, you often identify this as the Nazi salute, but it actually has a rather interesting history. And so way back in the French Revolution, I showed you this painting called the Tennis Court Oath, painted in 1791. And if you notice, all of these figures are raising their arms up. This other painting by the same artist shows the Oath of the Herati, an ancient Roman story, but there you have these guys saluting with their arms up. And in the 1700s, the late 1700s, a lot of Europeans thought this was how the Romans, ancient Romans, saluted. And there's very scant evidence. There's very little evidence they actually did this. Like there's this, like this one artifact here. And so in the late 1700s, it was known as the Roman salute, identified with the Roman Republic. Because remember, eventually in France, we have the formation of a republic. And so notice the photographs here. For a while, this was actually the way Americans saluted the flag, because it was a reference to the old Roman Republic, just like we have a republic. And, well, eventually Mussolini adopts it because of Italian nationalism, throwing things back to the old Roman days. And then eventually Hitler will adopt it. And basically when Hitler and Mussolini and the fascists adopt it, that's when we switch in the U.S. to putting our hands over our hearts. And so we have now, by 1930s, the rise of communism in the Soviet Union with its command economy and its emphasis on class, and we have the rise of fascism in Italy with its capitalist economy, but its emphasis on nationalism. And again, in both places, the state is greater than the individual with our anti-liberal, anti-democratic ways. And well, next video, I'll get into Germany and the rise of Nazi Germany.